negative reaction against a certain kind of metaphysics. Okay? So I guess that first I should describe the kind of metaphysics that I think it's a reaction to. It's a kind of metaphysics typical of pre-Kantian philosophy that is characterized, first of all, by the primacy that they give to demands for explanation, that why questions are the absolute prime object of philosophical inquiry. And the second characteristic is that they satisfy the demand by postulating things, specifically things that are beyond empirical access. Okay? So, for instance, realists of the traditional sort postulate the existence of abstract entities of a certain kind in order to explain many things. Right? Now, the empiricist, first of all, reacts against the idea that you can satisfy any demands that he has by postulating things to which we don't have any empirical access, any access through our experience. And then secondly, he reacts against the questions, because very often they are the kind of questions that you couldn't answer in any other way. So he rejects the questions. And the question why, the demand for explanation, doesn't have the kind of primacy for him that it has for these metaphysicians. Now, is there also something positive to be an empiricist? Right? I mean, this is a totally negative reaction. And historically, the people who are classified as empiricists have lots of positive things. They have positions. They make statements. Most of it I can't agree with. A lot of it is a sort of foundationalist epistemology of a sort that I think in the 20th century has very deservedly gone down in flames. But there is a rationale to their reaction, right? If they are not satisfied by postulating things that are beyond our empirical access, that must be because they just can't put much value in claims about that. So what I'm going to do is this. Let me try and see if I can give a positive statement of a sort that might characterize the empiricist belief that would go against what metaphysicians are doing, right? And see if that can give us a satisfactory empiricist position. Now, notice that there's a presupposition here. I'm presupposing that the way in which I have to make a philosophical position is to say you are like an empiricist exactly if you believe that and then give a factual statement. Right? So that will be the presupposition of the first part of my paper, and I'm going to see how that might work. Well, there are lots of candidates for a statement like that, a statement that empiricists believe as their central tenet. Okay? And let me begin anyway with a slogan formulation, and we could think about how to refine it. I'll write it down because I'll keep referring to it. Experience is our one and only source of information. Now, it's a slogan, okay? In other words, it's the sort of thing that you can say when people say, tell me what you are in 25 words or less. Right? There are going to have to be all kinds of qualifications. You have to make it more precise, etc., if you're going to stick with it. But this is a kind of slogan that I think you will probably agree with me tends to fit empiricists. Now, what would have to be done to this in order to make it a reasonable philosophical position? Well, I see all sorts of problems. And some of the problems I could probably remove by, say, asking, you know, what exactly did logical positivists say that goes under this heading, how did they refine it, and so on. But I think there are some problems that keep remaining no matter how I define it. The first one has to do with the fact that I'm using metaphor. The word source here is a metaphor, right? Now, I couldn't leave it as a metaphor But could I eliminate the metaphor? If I were a metaphysician and not an empiricist, then I would know how to go about that. I would say that, well, you know, what happens to us, our experience, right, is caused by the way the world is. And this causal relation is such that the information that we think we get resembles in some way the cause. Now, this is a relation of causation, and in many cases causal statements are a very simple, empirical, scientific type of statement, but in this case it doesn't seem to be. In this case it seems to be the kind of causation, the kind of causal link between two very different things that would be a typical part of a metaphysical system. I mean, Hume would be turning over in his grave if he heard me trying to make sense of empiricism in this way, right? So I don't think that would work. On the other hand, if it's a metaphor, well, then I haven't really told you what it's supposed to stand for, you know, unless I give it literal content. Now, I'm not going to talk about this problem, though I think it's a very serious one. I have a more serious problem that also I'm not able to eliminate. And it took me a little while to see exactly what the problem was, okay? But let me begin with this. Suppose I just ask, suppose somebody were to say this to me, and I ask, is it true? No, he said, well, that's my position. Yeah, but is it true? Well, how would we go find out about whether it's true or not? The trouble with it, of course, is that it is a statement of really unlimited scope. It's about experience as a whole, and appears to say there's a certain relation between experience as a whole and what it's experience of. Now, in a way, it covers itself, right? Because when I ask this person, is it true? Then I'm asking for information that might help me to see whether it's true or not. But this says that all information has to come from experience. It would be, of course, really absurd to say our one and only source of information is newspapers. But if somebody said it, right, and then I asked him, that's an interesting statement, is that true? And he said, yes, I can show you where it says so in the newspaper. That wouldn't help, right? Okay, so I felt there's a kind of circularity here and it's bothering me, but it's not actually a sort of circularity of the sort that it sounds like, because it sounds like I'm raising a skeptical problem if I say that, and merely a skeptical problem. Something like, you know, if you doubt everything, then you really have nothing left to stand on, and Descartes notwithstanding, you can't go on from there, that sort of thing, right? A skeptical problem of the sort that says you may rely on experience, but experience can never show you that it's reliable, and so if that's your only source, then you have nothing to rely on, and so you have to doubt everything. Now, that kind of problem I'm really not concerned with. I think of skepticism at this point as a problem that philosophers manage to handle. All the skeptical doubts, I think, have been addressed in ways that at least we can make up a menu about how the skeptical doubts can go and how you can answer them. Okay? I'm willing to talk about it with you, if you want to raise it in discussion, but that's not a problem I feel I have. I think it's a dead horse. Okay? There's another sort of problem that it reminds one of, and that is problems that people have in general with self-reference. That if you make a statement that refers to itself, you can get yourself into bad paradoxes. So if this is something about sources of information and covers itself, so to say, right, there might be a kind of circularity. And yes, there are kinds of circularity, and I'm going to get to some kinds of circularity, but it is not a simple fear of self-reference that is bothering me. There's all kinds of self-reference, all kinds of circles that I don't think are vicious. You take the following statement. Everything that can be said in English can be said in finitely many words. That's true, isn't it? But what I just said was itself an English statement. So my statement was also about itself. But I don't see any problem with the statement. You know, I think we all can see it's true. So self-reference, circularity of that sort in itself, I'm not going to object to either. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is just what I started out with. This looks like a metaphysical statement. What I'm looking for is a statement that will play a certain role. It has to be the empiricist position, right? So it has to have two characteristics. First of all, it's supposed to be an okay statement by empiricist standards. So it's not supposed to be something that postulates something about the world that's beyond empirical access. Well, that means it should be the sort of thing that empiricists say are okay, and that's just scientific hypotheses, empirical hypotheses, or things that could be empirical hypotheses. On the other hand, it's also supposed to be just what is at odds with the sort of things that these metaphysicians are doing. So it's supposed to be the sort of thing that metaphysicians, if they want to be metaphysicians, have to deny. But what they're about is giving statements that go beyond empirical access. So there has to be something in the statement that says you can't have something beyond empirical access. Right? But then it's also talking about what there is no empirical access to, so it doesn't look like an empirical hypothesis anymore. Now, this is not an argument. I'm just saying there are two roles it has to play, and the question is, I'm raising it as a question, could there be any statement at all that could play both those roles? It could be something that is just fine if you're an empirical scientist, the sort of statement you think that's just an ordinary empirical statement about the world and no empiricist will object to it. And it's also supposed to be the sort of thing that is absolutely at odds with any metaphysics. Now, can it be both? That's the question, right? Okay. Well, let's just try the first tack. Let's just say, what if we try to construe this as an ordinary empirical hypothesis? In fact, there is a science or a conglomerate of sciences today that deals with problems that look like that, cognitive science. Right? They deal with cognition as a subject for scientific inquiry. So why don't we give it to cognitive scientists and say, do what you can with it. Try and find out whether it's true or not. Right? And then maybe our philosophical problem will disappear. And there are philosophers of science today who have this as a plank in their program, that that's exactly how apparently epistemological questions ought to be dealt with. You should just say to a cognitive scientist, it's a statement about people, about how they can know things. That's the sort of thing you're investigating. Investigate it. Okay? Well, so let's think about what a cognitive scientist could do with it, what he would do with it. First of all, he would have to operationalize it. That means he has to do the sort of thing that I said I was having trouble with. He would have to eliminate the metaphor, right? He would have to give it a very concrete form so that you could actually see ways to test it. Now, suppose he does that, right? And I'll talk for in a moment about how he might do that, right? And then he has to design a test. He has to design an experimental way of inquiring into it. Okay, well, I think actually, once you ask yourself the question that way, it's not that difficult to figure out what a cognitive scientist would do. I mean, if you really took us seriously and said, yes, philosophers, I'm going to take on this project for you, right? Well, they would do what they typically do, right? I mean, first of all, they would apply for a big grant, right? Then I think that they would say this, experience, well, that's always experience of something by someone. So let's look at concrete cases. How about we have a certain experimental subject. You know, we hire an undergraduate to be the experimental subject, and say, Peter, we're interested in your experience of elephants. And we're going to test it in this particular case, Peter and his experience of elephants, right? Or Peter and elephants, an experience. So the thesis would be something like this. The thesis would be, in his case, that the one and only source of information that Peter has about elephants is experience. Now, his own experience or others' experience, right? And there's a lot of information you get from other people's experience, so I'm not going to exclude that. So we have a particular case here. I'll write it as this way. Star, Peter, elephants. Or in general, for any subject X, any topic Y, star XY. So it says, you know, with the metaphor removed in whatever way that's done, I don't know, it says that experience is the one and only source of information about elephants for Peter. And then we have to set up two kinds of experiments, two stages in the experiment. We can do them on alternate days. Some days we put him in a cage with elephants. Other days we put him in a sensory deprivation tank. In both cases we measure his information about elephants before and after. And we ask, has it increased? Now, is that the way to do it? And whatever you find, you could then do with a lot of people and a lot of topics, choose them at random from the encyclopedia, for example, and then try and generalize on your data. And wouldn't that do it then? Right? Suppose that it all came out very nicely, then you could finally say, well, everybody is such that for every topic, the one and only source of information they have is experience. And then it would be settled, right? It would be settled. And that would be treating it like an empirical hypothesis in the way a scientist should. Now, I think this is completely bogus. I think that it sounds like a project, a scientific project, but it isn't. It isn't significant science in any way at all. Let's first of all ask whether this thesis, the general thesis, could be falsified or disconfirmed in this project. Okay? Now, remember that there's two kinds of experiments it involves. The cage experiments and the tank experiments. In the one case, we make sure that there's experience of elephants. In the other case, we make sure there's no experience of elephants. Right? Now, suppose that we get bad results from the cage experiments. So, for instance, we put Peter in a cage with elephants, take him out after 2 hours, and he comes out completely disgusted and full of false information about elephants. Right? That sounds like a negative result, right? But you know, we wouldn't take it as disconfirming or falsifying this thesis. You know, we'd say, well, first of all, there's always a certain amount of noise in the experiments, and you get out some false information. We have a theory of errors to deal with that. We will have to put in some controls. And if he comes out with no new information at all, then we just say, well, it may be experience, but it's not relevant experience. It turns out that experience that you can get information about elephants from isn't being in a cage with them, that's all. Right? So it doesn't look like with this kind of experiment you could get negative evidence, really. What about this kind of experiment? Now that's more problematic. Quine has a new book he published, I guess it was just this year, called Pursuit of Truth. And Quine has done various things to influence the very idea of what empiricism is. In this last book, he takes this up, and there are two places where he mentions telepathy. In the first place, he seems to be saying that the sort of thing I'm suggesting here is right, because he says maybe all that's left of empiricism, after his own criticisms of it, is a refusal to give credence to anything like clairvoyance or telepathy. So what he's saying is that that you don't think the following might happen. You put the person in the sensory deprivation tank for 2 hours. He has no experience of any but the most minimal sort. Then afterward you question him, and you find that all of a sudden he has a lot of new, true information about elephants. Okay? And you say, gosh, is it possible that people become clairvoyant when they're in a sensory deprivation tank? Right? On the other hand, Quine himself seems to have seen the difficulty with his suggestion, because I think it's about 20 pages later that he says that, of course, as good empiricists, we can't rule out that telepathy and clairvoyance could happen. So then, if that was all that was left of empiricism for him, then there's nothing left. So that suggests that you could actually disconfirm this with this kind of experiment. But I think that is not true either, because think about what would really happen. Suppose that, in fact, we get these people coming out of the tank and they've got new information about elephants. Okay, now we ask them, oh, you're giving all these new answers. Where did you get them? And I don't know exactly what happens in these tanks. I know that people pay money to go into them, not just to be experimental subjects, but because it has some other value. I don't know what it is. And they would talk presumably about dreams, daydreams, hallucinations, or even just say, well, it just came to me when I was in the tank. Okay? Suddenly these thoughts and pictures were bubbling up in my mind. Now, the important thing about the reaction of the scientist here is what he counts as data as opposed to information in general. There's no question that this person coming out of the tank has more information about more true information among his opinions about elephants than he had before. That's what we are hypothesizing. But does he have new data, or does this give us new data about elephants? No, that's not what the data are. The data are that he had certain dreams or hallucinations. You see the distinction I'm making? And then scientists might, after they had a lot of stuff like this, offer a hypothesis, which is that there's a very strong correlation between the things that people say just came to them, the daydreams they had in the tank, and what is true about elephants. And they would test that hypothesis. And if it tested out well, they would then even start relying on it, right? Say, to make predictions about elephant behavior. But they would not say that they had gotten data which were not data of experience. Because what they would count as data would be this, that the subject had those experiences. Now, notice that there's a difference in treatment here, and I'm not totally sure how to characterize it. But if in an experiment the lab assistant says the pointer is at 7, they write down under data the pointer is at 7. Okay? But in a psychological experiment, if not the lab assistant, but the subject says the pointer is at 7, then they have to write down the subject reports, quote, the pointer is at 7. Okay? Now, I'm not entirely sure how this all works, but that is how it is done. I'm absolutely convinced. So you can get negative results this way about the thesis. No matter what happens in experiments like this, nobody's going to say, we found a source of data that is not experience. Okay? Well, let's try and look on the other side. Do you think that this scientific investigation could confirm this thesis? And again, at first sight, it looks like the answer is yes, because suppose that all the time you get the sort of things we really expect. More information from the cage, no information from the tank. Right? It sounds like it confirms. But now we have to, when we think about this, we have to really take seriously the scope of this statement. The possible circularity even of a statement that is so universal, unlimited in scope. Because it also applies not just to the experimental subjects, but to the investigators, right? So what we have to do is we have to look at how they investigate. Now, what are they supposed to do as scientists? They're supposed to write down as data only the things that they see or hear, not the things that they dream or fantasize. And they are supposed to write down exactly those things. They're not supposed to withhold what they hear and see of the relevant category. Right? That's the practice. That's what they have to do. So the method is one that seems to be acting as if this is right. Okay? But of course, that means that the results rely on that method working. So what we get is something like this. What's established is not a general thesis, but rather, if the thesis holds in a certain domain, namely for the experimenters in their inquiry, in some limited domain, let's call it D prime, then it holds in general. Where, the whole of the domain is the relationship between experience and facts or the truth throughout, for everyone. Right? In a limited experiment, how would it go? I'm not going to say this by itself already shows you that it can't do it. Okay? No, I think we have to look carefully at what would happen in an experiment, what a limited experiment would be like, and how this would differ. In a limited experiment, well, suppose that the experiment is something like this. I'm going to investigate people's color discrimination. And what I do is, and especially say at twilight, under bad lighting conditions. And so I have a lot of bits of orange peel and lemon peel that I lay out on the table. And the subjects have to very quickly distinguish between them. Right? Now, the experimenter who's writing down the results, he has to know which are the orange, which are the lemon. But in this experiment, he doesn't rely on his own color discrimination of orange and lemon. What he can do is he can put black numbers on the backs of the pieces of peel. Okay? He doesn't want his own problems with color, and he doesn't want any assumptions about how well he can distinguish the color under those lighting conditions to enter into testing hypotheses about this color distinction. Okay. But then, of course, he relies on his ability to distinguish black letters against the white background. Now, that's still reliance on vision in a certain way. Should he check up on that too? Suppose that he were to do that and he were to try and add other signals like auditory signals or touch signals, well, he would still be relying on perception. Should he check into that too? Well, obviously the answer is that is not what is done. There's a certain practice, and I think it's a really crucial element of scientific practice, that in any experimental inquiry, some things are given the status of being reliable but defeasible. I have to explain that. Reliable but defeasible. That means that they are treated as reliable. For instance, in this experiment, the experimenter's ability to distinguish black numerals is treated as reliable. But defeasible means that there's a willingness, which doesn't disappear, of checking that out if seriously challenged. Okay? So that in the scientific method, many procedures get this status, are treated as reliable by the experimenters. But they always keep the status of being defeasible, which is nothing is beyond question. Now, if they didn't have this practice, they couldn't carry on their investigation. Because if they didn't treat anything as reliable, they would end up in an infinite regress. They would have to check everything that they checked. But if they didn't treat it as defeasible, it wouldn't be scientific, it would be dogmatic. So this is a very crucial sort of status, right, that something can have. Now, that is also the exact sense in which experience is treated as a source of information by science. that the things it's calling data get that status in a reliable but defeasible way. Okay? So talking about this is a way of explicating what this means when you say that science acts like this. So if the inquiry is supposed to be exactly into whether that is right or not, then it is into this practice of assigning reliable but defeasible status to whatever you're momentarily assuming. If you wanted to target that, you would have to give that up for your own investigation. But then you would end up in a regress. Okay? Well, I know this is a bit abstruse, and I'm offering it as an argument, for your scrutiny. But let me give a parallel that maybe can sum up a little in a graphic way why I think that this whole investigation I sketched here is not real science, is not significant science, but is bogus. Okay? Here's my parallel. Suppose that at the end of the war there was some Nazi colony on an island that was quite isolated and it was unaffected by the end of the war. And this little Nazi colony developed its own Nazi culture. Okay? And suppose that now, 45 years later, although they've been thriving and flourishing out of contact with the rest of the world, somebody raises the question whether moral insight is reliable. And they become sufficiently exercised by the question that they set up an empirical investigation about whether moral insight is reliable. And so they send out teams of investigators, and they come back with very good reports. They say, of course, we have many individual cases, and we'll tell you the individual cases, and we'll tell you the statistics. Everything looks very fine. This woman saw a case of miscegenation, and she judged it horrible. There's a good positive instance. And that man saw a case of somebody not glorifying the fatherland, and he realized it was horrible, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, obviously, the investigators are relying on moral insight themselves here, because they have to be able to distinguish the right outcomes from the wrong ones. Okay? So suppose that we were in contact with them and we could raise an objection and say, we don't think this establishes that moral insight in your culture is reliable. In fact, we think your moral insight is perverse. They would say, well, what about the results of empirical inquiry? Aren't you scientific? Right? You say, yeah, but it was relying on the moral insight of the investigators. Now, they said, oh, you mean this? We've really only established that if it holds for the investigators, then it holds for everybody. But why are you raising a doubt about that? Do you think that we took a biased or bad sample of people as our investigators? They were all party leaders in good standing. Right? Now, this is not, what I'm doing at the moment is not raising a skeptical doubt about morality. You can see that the very same story could be told about our culture. We could send out the investigators. It would be equally bogus. Right? You can go from that to something like moral relativism. That doesn't follow. But that the investigation was bogus, that it is not a good empirical investigation, that you can conclude. Right? Now, as I said before, there are philosophers of science who think that this is just the sort of thing that ought to happen with theses in philosophy, that they should be given over to cognitive science whenever they are about human knowledge and so on. And my suspicion is that in many cases there will be these methodological difficulties. Okay. So something that I've been trying hasn't worked, right? Let me get out my watch. I suggested that perhaps we could find a statement, maybe this, or maybe a statement like this, such that you could say, to be an empiricist is to believe that. And what didn't work was this. It had to have two roles. First of all, it had to be something like a good empirical hypothesis, otherwise an empiricist wouldn't stand for it as part of his position. But secondly, it had to be big enough, general enough, unlimited enough to rule out metaphysics. But that doesn't work. If you make it a statement of unlimited scope, it turns out you can't have an empirical investigation of the right sort. Right? So now I have to think about my presupposition. Right? And my presupposition was that if you're going to characterize a philosophical position, you have to do it by saying, to have the position, that means to believe something. So now let's see if we can reject that. Is it possible, are there philosophical positions that don't consist in believing something? If you ask me for examples of philosophical positions, then I very quickly come up with a lot of them. First of all, a lot of realisms. Realism about universals, realism about numbers, realism about space and time, realism about the modalities, etc., etc. All of these appear to be statements of belief. There are universals. There are abstract entities. Numbers really exist. Okay? These are all statements of fact. So they appear to be straightforward beliefs. Right? Then next I'll give a lot of examples of anti-realisms, like the nominalist who says there is no abstract entity. There are no universals. Hartree-Field, who says there are no real numbers. Quine, who says that who says the same thing about modalities in whatever way you want to phrase that. There is no such thing as real necessity. Again, these are statements of fact. Right? They say that's not the way it is. The first kind says that is the way it is. The other kind says it's not the way it is. These are statements of fact. So the most obvious examples of philosophical positions appear to be beliefs, factual beliefs. Is there any other kind? Well, actually, in the 20th century, there have been various attempts to develop philosophical positions that do not seem to be like that. Existentialism, various parts of the phenomenological movement, at one point also logical positivism, then the followers of the later Wittgenstein. In every one of those cases, though, if I look at the history, I have the feeling that in very short order, the people in that neighborhood in philosophy turned to metaphysics again. Okay? So, is it possible? Well, I will take up one such attempt and see if we can make it work here. I'm still very tentative about it, but I think that maybe there is something good to be investigated there. And that was the attempt made by Carnap. Carnap has a paper called Empiricism, Semantics, and Ontology. And he suggested that there was an alternative which consisted in choosing a language. That having a belief or taking on a belief is not the same. That choosing a language is not taking on a belief or having a belief. And that a person's philosophical position could be manifest exactly in the choice of language. The choice of language. Now, it's not immediately obvious how this might help the empiricist. The empiricist has certain attitudes. He has a negative attitude against metaphysics. He has a positive attitude toward empirical science. Well, those are attitudes. Okay? Maybe I should have a single word for something like attitudes, choices, commitments. So let me use the word stance. A stance is a clutter of choices, attitudes, commitments. Right? And Carnap suggested that a stance could be or could be modeled as a choice of language. Now, this had to do with, of course, with the positivist reaction to metaphysics. They were empiricists, or they tried to be. Their reaction to metaphysics was to say, it is literally nonsense. The statements these metaphysicians are making can only be made in a language which we do not regard as meaningful. Okay? Now, he wrote this quite late in his life, but you can see it as a reflection on what he was doing early in his life. So his own rejection of metaphysics would consist in his choice of language and his choice to exclude certain things from his language. Now, what does this mean? I mean, what is it to have a language, to choose a language, and so on? First of all, what is a language? Well, in the way philosophers think about, I mean, I'm talking within the analytic tradition, obviously. In the way analytic philosophers think about language, if I wanted to teach you a language, right, I would do that in 3 stages, really. First of all, I would teach you the syntax, and that means the vocabulary and the grammar. And if I did that, I could then give you a test, and maybe you would pass it with flying colors, but that wouldn't mean that you knew what any of it meant, okay? Because you can learn the grammar and the vocabulary like you can learn playing chess or something like that, or numerology, right? So then I would start teaching you semantics for the language. That means, first of all, I would tell you about some words, what they refer to. Like I would say, the word Cicero in that language refers to Mr. Tully. Right? I would also have to give you some global rules, though. I would have to say things that implied that no matter what you said it about, if you said that something was warmer than itself, you'd be speaking nonsense. So there would be these very specific reference links, but there would also be some global things I would have to teach you about what is nonsense and what isn't. What's a self-contradiction and what isn't. And then thirdly, I would have to do this for pragmatics, which has to do specifically with your own use. So for instance, I would say this word I always has to be used by any speaker to refer to himself. Right? Now, can you learn languages that way? I mean, of course, it's very schematic. If you take a class in Dutch, you won't be taught it in right that order, right? Okay, but can you? Yeah, sure. Certainly you could learn it that way, right? But you could learn lots of languages that way. I think that we should think especially about examples of bits of language that some philosophers like and some philosophers reject. For instance, Quine makes it clear that modal language, with words like necessarily, possibly, if this were the case, then that would be the case, the counterfactual and so on, he rejects as part of the official serious language. Okay? Whereas David Lewis, my colleague, accepts that and works out the semantics and so on for the language perfectly. Now, he does it so well that he can tell all of us exactly how that language works. He can teach us the language in the way I was saying. And as a matter of fact, I'm sure that Quine could give a seminar on David Lewis's philosophy in such a way that nobody could tell that he wasn't entirely behind it. He could speak the language perfectly. And I also have lots of doubts about some of the things that David is saying, but if ever David, now this would never happen, but if ever he gave me a valid argument in that language, I could spot it and tell him so. Okay? In a way, I can say, I can speak this language to the best of them, but it's not my language. Now, what does that mean? You know? What does it mean it's not my language? I know it. If knowing it is a criterion for having it, then I have it. But it's not my language. Because, in fact, now maybe I should now speak not entirely in my own person, okay? Because I'm not always sure what I believe. I'm not always sure what my philosophical position is. But imagine that I am a very strict sort of empiricist along the lines that Quine was laying out around 1950, right? In his book Word and Object, for instance. That means that my language would stay entirely extensional, and whenever a word like necessarily came up, I would say that's unintelligible. Okay? So I would be in the position where I would regard it as unintelligible, and still I would know the language to the extent that anybody would know it after taking the course and passing all the exams. So there seems to be a bit more to having a language than knowing it. There are other things that I can probably talk in my own person. The word qua. I think I still use words like qua or as such, though for a long time now I've been convinced that they make no sense at all. You know, it's not even modal, okay? It necessarily has problems, but they're nothing compared to the problems that the word qua has, okay? So strictly speaking, I reject that from my language. Strictly speaking, to me, that's unintelligible. I know how to make the moves, so to say. Well, that's it. Huh? Well, what is there to having a language if it is not knowing something? Well, that's important because we don't, you know, the whole scheme won't work unless we have something that is not the same as believing or knowing something. Right? To have the language is not the same as believing something about the world. Now, there's a lot of problems too, and for a long time I thought that these problems would totally destroy Carnap's approach. I think that I need about 8 minutes to tell you the problems, and I'll end with that. The first problem is one that Carnap himself already mentioned. We don't come by our language by choosing a language, right? I mean, you grew up, you learned your language in a way you don't know how. You didn't choose it. So what does it mean to choose a language? Well, he said, okay, you didn't choose your language in that way, but it is nevertheless a matter of choice. And these examples of how you can reject the part of your language that you've always used and start, you know, saying that's beyond the pale, that is not to be used seriously anymore, it's not intelligible, that shows you how you have a choice. You could read Quine's book Word and Object and be completely converted. And from then on, reject everything in your language that wasn't extensional. Right? And try and always, very conscientiously, speak this perfectly extensional language. Right? So that's the sense in which you have a choice. Not that you can just sort of sit there before your birth and look at the menu of possible languages and pick one. Right? But that's not the point. The second thing is that Carnap seems to rely on this famous analytic-synthetic distinction. There's a difference between what's true by virtue of what your language is like and what's just true because of the facts. And he had a disagreement with Quine about that. If anybody wants to bring that up, I'll be happy to talk about it. I think that on Carnap's behalf, the objection can be answered. Okay, but I'll go on for now. The third objection is more important. I think it's very important. Could the choice of language be rational? Well, let's try something more specific. Could you give reasons? If you couldn't give reasons, could you defend what you've done? There's a problem here. Suppose that, well, I mean, let me tell a little fictional story again. Suppose that, as a matter of fact, until last Christmas, I was the old-fashioned empiricist ideal man. And I spoke this perfectly extensional language of Quine's Word and Object. No necessity, no counterfactual conditionals, no, if this were the case, then that were the case, no possibility, nothing hyper-intentional, no qua especially, right, okay. But something happened over the holidays, and at Epiphany, I totally converted to the language of my friend David Lewis. And now I say necessarily, possibly, I say there's objective chance, I say if I had been French, I would have been born in the Rhone Valley, things like that. Okay, now could that be a rational choice? I think we have to say that at first sight, this could be a rational choice. Right? I mean, it's not as if David is irrational by having his language, and it's not as if I was irrational by not having it. But could I have given any reasons for making such a choice? Well, I would have had to say something like, it looks to me like David's language has certain advantages. That he can describe aspects of the world which I cannot describe. But I couldn't do that, because the sort of things that he could say were totally unintelligible to me. The conditions under which he can describe something I can't were conditions that I could not describe in my language. Now, suppose that after Epiphany, though, you ask me, why did you do this? Well, then I can give some reasons, because now I have the bigger language, right? Suppose I say, and well, this is a good example because it's one that could be a reason for me if I ever did it. In discussions of quantum mechanics, in the mid-60s, there was a theorem by Bell, became a famous theorem about Bell's inequalities. And it was immediately famous because it was clear that there were experiments that quantum mechanics had allowed us to do that violated these inequalities. Right? So what was it the theorem about? Well, it was a theorem that under certain assumptions you would get these inequalities, and then a demonstration that in quantum mechanics, in things you can actually see done in the laboratory, they're violated. Okay. Now, very quickly after that, several articles appeared in which people deduced those inequalities from apparently no assumptions at all. That's a priori truth. Okay? What they did it in a language in which you could say these counterfactual conditionals, in which you could say things like, if I had done the experiment another way, the outcome would still have been X. So in David Lewis's type of language, you could say it. Okay? Now, before Christmas, what could I have said about this sort of thing? Well, I would have said something like this. These arguments they gave, they can be formulated in a language like David Lewis's and in several other languages in which you have that kind of resource. And in some of those languages, they are valid arguments, strictly formally speaking. And in other of those languages, they're not valid arguments, formally speaking. But you know, it's all like playing chess and playing Go and playing dominoes. It has no real relevance to what's happening in the science. I would have been saying that in my pre-Christmas stage, right? Because none of it made sense to me. In fact, it's sort of what I say now, to be honest. But if I had gone through this conversion, then after Epiphany, I would say, and I would be speaking David Lewis's language, I would say, well, it's very easy to spot the fallacy in their arguments. Because look, in this argument at this place, they're relying on a principle that's not a logical principle, and in fact is invalid. And I can give you other examples where if you use that rule, you get false conclusions. Now that's a very satisfying feeling when you can react like that, right? So after the conversion, I can say, I can now do lots of things which I certainly couldn't do before. What about before Christmas? Could I have thought about myself of having advantages after Epiphany? Yeah, I could have thought of myself in the following way. I could have pictured it to myself. And in that picture, I would see myself saying things that were totally unintelligible. Right? Okay. Well, the point of this is that for rational choice, you shouldn't ask too much. You shouldn't ask the impossible. You should ask everything that's possible, but not the impossible. So I think Carnap could defend it that way. And then there's one more problem, and maybe it's the most important. Maybe it can be handled. There is a sense in which it is really a bad oversimplification to say that a person has one language. Okay? Because if you have a language, you are automatically also in a position to reflect on that language and to say things about it. Now, you can say things about the language in the language itself, unless the language is deficient in some other ways that are not very practical. So in a way, it's like this. If you have a language, you also are somehow inside this whole hierarchy of languages, because you can always reflect on what you're doing and speak a richer language. Mind you, it's only richer automatically in some very restricted ways. You know, just that you can add words like "is true" and so on. Okay. So that if I want to insist that having a language is not the same as believing something, I will also have to make out that having a language does not mean believing something about your own language, the richer language that you can get to in this very simple way. I think it's easy to state that problem, very hard to actually deal with it. But I think it's probably possible. I mean, probably, I think I can see some ways to deal with it. Suppose that all the objections can be answered. Suppose that Carnap's program can work. What does that mean then? Well, I would have a hope that you could actually have an empiricist position, that you could be an empiricist, or could try to be an empiricist, in the sense of having a certain stance, a stance toward how to deal with questions, a stance that involves a very negative attitude toward certain kinds of metaphysics, a very positive attitude toward empirical science, a willingness to always discuss every issue where you're at odds with someone else by retrenching to a common ground. I think that is something that empiricists see as key in science. And it's the sort of thing that, I don't think that science applies to everything in a very simple way, but that might be the sort of thing that could be generalized, so it's part of our way of dealing with everything. Right? And possibly this could be made concrete by saying it's manifest in a certain choice of language, that this is a good model for a stance. And that empiricism then doesn't have to be a position that amounts to believing that something about the world is thus or so, which doesn't seem to work at all. Okay.
Take some time now to entertain questions.
About this question about this thing about the limited domain is like people who claim to have seen UFOs, but while they've seen them, they were probably under a trance life state or taking some hallucinogenic drug. And they say then the scientists who investigate these things like that, they probably say these things probably exist or something. And what do you say about that? Would that be a limited domain?
Yeah, I think that is a limited inquiry of a sort that can be perfectly scientific. At least at this stage, the only information we can treat as data is that so-and-so reported sight of a UFO. Okay? Now, if we treat it, we cannot treat it as laboratory assistants saying the needle is on 7, which is just entered as a datum, right? But now, this also puts, there's a limit to what you can find out in a straightforward way, as long as you insist that the data are just that so-and-so reported his experience, right? Because you'll have to get some other data, if you're another type of data, if you're ever going to decide about whether he really saw one, right? Because from the fact that many different people reported, it doesn't follow that they were seeing them. Even if they're totally sincere, they believe entirely what they're saying, and so on. But that doesn't mean that you are going to find data which are not information coming from experience. The other data you will have to find are, like, so to say, data of your own, like scorch marks in the earth and sightings on radar screens and so on. I think I think there's lots of. When I say this about cognitive science, my criticism is of the philosophers who've suggested certain cognitive science projects. That people can do lots of good work, scientific work in cognitive psychology, I don't deny at all.
I mean, I guess what I'm asking is if all of us could see UFOs, if we were in this...
Oh, in this translation. Oh, I see.
Would that be also still a limited domain?
Yeah, I think that science could not, under those conditions, treat there is a UFO as a datum. If it always has to be in this trance-like state, the datum would just be that people have these experiences when in trance-like states. Okay. Now, of course, it is possible that you might want to offer as a scientific hypothesis that these experiences are really caused by UFOs. Okay? In the way that you might, under other, and see, in fact, if I can get you bothered about the same problems by giving you these examples. In the Republic, this is at a point where Socrates has been arguing that poetry has to be banned from the Republic. They're not going to have poetry in an ideal republic. And then he draws an analogy, and here's the analogy. He says, "My dear friends, we shall behave like people who have fallen in love, but realize that their passion is not beneficial. They force themselves to stay away from their loved one." Now, I think this must be a bit of Socrates' famous irony, right? I mean, people were no different then from what they are now, and if they realize that they're in love with the wrong person, they're even more likely to go to them, right? On the other hand, it only works, the irony only works, if it's only just there. So it can look like he's presenting us with a perfect example or a paradigm example of somebody really rational. This person realizes that his emotions are running one way. He's fallen in love. He realizes it's bad for him. And how does he act? Well, he stays away. Because he thinks that if he were near the person he loves, then he would do foolish things. Now, is that rational? Or is it, in fact, a paradigm example of rationality? There's another example that's like that, more famous, in Homer, of Ulysses and the sirens. Ulysses believes that if they come close to the sirens the next morning and he hears a siren song and he's in command of the ship, then like many other poor, hapless sailors before him, he will steer toward the sirens and he will shipwreck the ship, right? So he has himself tied to the mast and he gets all the other sailors to put wax in their ears so they can't hear it. Now, notice what he's doing. He foresees that the next morning, under those conditions, he will have different opinions, different values from what he has now. And he sabotages his own future self. He takes steps to keep himself from acting on his own opinions and values the next morning, right? And this is often given as an example of rational, prudent action. And yeah, I suppose that, thinking about it one way, it is. But if you think of it as somebody sabotaging himself, under that description doesn't sound too rational, right? Isn't it rational not to sabotage yourself? Also, you know, he is taking a certain attitude with respect to himself at a later time. The attitude is paternalistic, right? I know what's good for you. I'm going to make sure that what happens is what's good for you. Not what you want, not what you think, or what I think. Right? Now, he's doing this with respect to his own future self. If that's rational, does that mean also that tomorrow morning the rational thing for that future self would be to try and do that to himself for a later stage still? You know, or is there some sort of asymmetry that makes us say, no, no, what he's doing now is rational, but anything he does tomorrow morning is not rational? There is some sort of difficulty here, right? I mean, I can't quite make out what it is to be rational if I put the example in these general terms. Also, of course, there's a bit of a problem in my mind about this foreseeing how I will feel tomorrow morning. If I were Ulysses. Now, so I went and read the Odyssey again, and the Odyssey is written as if Ulysses doesn't have any inner life. You don't see or hear him reasoning or thinking about this. The witch tells him this is what will happen. He goes to the ship and he tells his sailors that's what's going to happen. And he acts in accordance with what she suggests. So I can't tell from that whether he is going through some sort of reasoning that is rational, or whether I'm supposed to reconstruct it in a way that's rational, or how he thinks that he knows at that point what will happen to him tomorrow morning. I guess he has absolute faith in this witch, but is that, the right way to do it? Could you have it any other way? Well, surely there are ways in which we can know what we're going to do. Right? Now, I want to think about this, these possibilities of thinking about what your own opinions and values are and what they will be, and how this can play a role in your deliberation and your action, how you might take steps to actually encroach on your own freedom, whether that's rational or not, under what conditions it might be rational. That's the sort of problem I want to address. Okay, so first problem then is, how is it possible, and how is it possible to have this kind of foresight about our own future? Okay? How do I know what I'm going to do, for example? Well, quite a long time ago, when I was a graduate student at Pittsburgh, I heard 3 lectures by Stuart Hampshire, and they became a little book of his called Freedom of the Individual. And right in the first lecture already, he had this very intriguing idea that I kept puzzling about through the whole 3 days. He said that sometimes we can know what we're going to do because of what we intend. We know what we're going to do because we intend to do that. For example, I know that tomorrow I'm going to Minneapolis because I intend to go to Minneapolis tomorrow. Okay? And this is a kind of privileged knowledge because you can't know what I'm going to do by having your intentions, and you can know it by having my intentions either. Right? But what kind of knowledge is that? Well, here's a simple idea about it that doesn't work. Does it just mean that I know something about myself, namely that I have a certain intention? And do I know in addition something about the connection between people's intentions and what will happen? Is that the explanation of how it is that I can know what I'm going to do by intending to do it? Well, no. That's not the explanation. It can't be the explanation. Let me give you an example so you can see the difference. Suppose that you go to someone and finally, taking all your courage in your hands, you say, "Will you marry me?" Okay. And suppose that she answers, "I fully intend to marry you, and statistical studies show that in 75% of all such cases, marriage follows." Now, there's something a little wrong with the story, right? In fact, if you get that answer, that's not what you wanted to hear, right? Now, why not? Let's imagine that, in fact, you fully believe her answer. That is, you believe that she is sincere when she says, "I fully intend to marry you." And secondly, so this is a conjunction, right? She's saying 2 things, A and B. The first part she says is, "I fully intend to marry you," and you believe that she is sincere and she fully intends that. And then the second part, well, say that you've read the very same statistical studies as she has, and so you also believe that. You believe both parts, so you believe the whole thing. So there's nothing wrong on that account. You believe that what she says is true. And still, that's not... In fact, at that point, you don't come away from there saying something like, "She knows that she's going to marry me," or even, "She believes that she's going to marry me." And certainly not, "I'm sure she's going to marry me," right? Now, what you had hoped is that she would just say, "Yes, I will," expressing her intention. And then you would have thought, like Hampshire, that she knows what she's going to do, and she knows what she's going to do because she intends to do that. But that's not equivalent, apparently, to knowing what the intention